Hello, Light in August, lecture number 4. I want to begin today by considering some of the formal and stylistic features in Light in August beyond those that I've discussed in earlier lectures. I've noted that the novel's temporal dislocations require the reader to assemble a chronology or storyline out of the scrambled plot. But it's not just that Faulkner inserts flashbacks into the ongoing present of his narrative to suggest a constant eruption of the past into the lives of his characters, nor is it just that his practice of looping back is meant to events that we've already witnessed to cause us to feel a sense of destiny that matches the character's own experience. I've talked about both those things, but Faulkner's time disruptions also include something else that I want to consider now, and that is delaying essential pieces of information. These pose another challenge for Faulkner's reader because withholding information causes us, when we receive it, to be required to revise our understanding of earlier scenes and of the characters themselves. For example, when at the end of chapter 12 we learn that Joanna Burton has a gun that she fires at Joe and that she has intended to use to kill him and then turn on herself, our reading of the murder scene and of Joe's role in it changes. We realize now that it wasn't simply an execution of a passive victim. Similarly, after our first impression of Joe, learning his history of abuse at the orphanage and at McGurkin's, as well as Bobby's betrayal of him, that information that comes after our first introduction modifies that sense of him that we first had as merely cold and brutal. Well, by delaying crucial pieces of information, Faulkner requires the reader to continually revisit the past of the novel, to flip back to scenes that we've already read, just as his characters are continually pulled back into their familial and cultural pasts. The most extreme instance of this delayed information technique, I think, is one that we'll encounter today. The long-withheld account by Hines and his long-suffering wife of Joe Christmas's origins, Joe's parentage, birth, and abduction. Now, encountering such essential background about a character so late in the novel poses a challenge in reception, and one that I think we find in many modernist novels, but especially in Faulkner. Now, in literary theory, this dilemma gives rise to what's called the hermeneutic circle, and it goes like this. In order to understand the whole of a novel, we must know its various parts in order to arrive at the end. But in order to really understand any of those constituent parts as we read them, we need already to know the whole in advance. To understand this, for example, to understand why the janitor, for example, who abducts Joe in chapter 6, in order to understand that motive, we would need to know that this man is Hines, his crazed grandfather, which we discover only in chapter 16. Similarly, in order to understand in chapter 5 why Joe feels an urge to violence when Joanna asks him to pray, we would need to know his history of religious persecution with McGurkin that comes 2 chapters later. In order to understand the earlier parts of the novel, in short, we must revisit them in light of what we learn later. So it means that we must either then reread the book as soon as we've finished it, or more plausibly, we must go back and reread earlier sections of the novel after important pieces of delayed information come to light. Well, the effect of this continual movement forward and backward as we read forces us to be active interpreters in making and remaking the novel's meaning. Faulkner uses this technique of withholding information in some of his other novels as well. In As I Lay Dying, for example, he makes us wait most of the narrative before the dead mother, Addie, reveals in her monologue why each of her children is damaged in the particular way he or she is. In Absalom, Faulkner makes us wait until nearly the end of the novel to discover why a murder 60 years in the past actually occurred. Well, one of Faulkner's inspirations for this practice is, as you might have guessed, the detective novel, a genre that Faulkner particularly liked and used in his own interesting way. Typically, detective stories begin with a murder, and what follows is a discovery of who committed it, and the missing or withheld pieces of information are gradually revealed. Well, early in Light in August, we learn that Joanna Burton has been killed. But in Faulkner, unlike the conventional detective narrative, the hermeneutic suspense is not in finding out who did it. Okay, we know that it's Joe Christmas quite early on. The question is rather why he killed her, something that requires constant revision and moving back and forth. Faulkner's novels are sometimes described as psychological or metaphysical detective narratives in which the active reader is challenged to speculate about causes and to reread earlier passages as details from the past are disclosed. Now, Faulkner's prose style also requires commentary, I think, at this point in our study, because throughout the Joe Christmas sections and thereafter, the narrator's prose becomes more noticeably distinctive. Specifically, it becomes more turgid, more loaded with adjectives, and longer sentence structures. Also, it becomes more urgent in its piling on of subordinate clause upon subordinate clause, and it becomes, at the same time, this style, more flagrantly metaphorical in its descriptions. For example, consider this description of old Hines after he's lost his job following his abduction of Joe from the Memphis orphanage. We're told, then he lost the Memphis job or quit it. One weekend he came home, and when Monday came, he did not go away. After that, he was downtown all day long, about the square in Mottstown, untalkative, dirty, with that furious and preclusive expression about the eyes which the people took for insanity, that quality of outworn violence like a scent and odor, that fanaticism like a fading and almost extinct ember of some kind of two-fisted evangelicism which had been 1/4 violent conviction and 3/4 physical hardihood. Now, it's as if, in a style like this, as if by an accretion of qualifying adjectives and an expansion in the length of the sentences, and that was one sentence, it's as if through those stylistic elements, Faulkner wants to create a kind of rhetorical force in the style to mimic and convey the forces of history, of destiny, that are as monumental and extreme as the prose itself becomes at times. This matching, then, of the late style in the novel to this subject is especially evocative in the case of Joe Christmas and Joanna Burton's doomed relationship, in which they both operate under the burdens of their familial and racial and religious pasts. We get passages such as this during the second phase of their relationship. Joe stayed, watching the two creatures inside Joanna Burton that struggled in one body, like two moon-gleamed shapes struggling, drowning in alternate throes upon the surface of a black, thick pool beneath the last moon. Now it would be that still, cold, contained figure of the first phase, who, even though lost and damned, remained somehow impervious and impregnable. And then it would be the other, the second one, who in furious denial of that impregnability strove to drown in the black abyss of its own creating that physical purity which had been preserved too long now even to be lost. There is another stylistic trait that Faulkner introduces throughout his presentation of this relationship. The omniscient narrator sometimes exhibits, in describing Joe and Joanna's connection, a peculiar tendency to question his own assertions with words like maybe and perhaps in describing the interior life of his characters. For example, when Joe breaks into Joanna Burton's kitchen, we're told perhaps he thought of that other window with the rope, perhaps not. Later, the narrator tells us, Perhaps Joanna was moved by the sheer instinctive feminine cunning in her affair with Joe. Perhaps not, end quote. Why these curious qualifications, these disclaimers of certainty? Well, we saw Mon's narrator impose similar imaginary limits on his omniscience late in The Magic Mountain, but there it was for a different reason. Mon did so to remind us that we're reading a novel and called attention to fictional conventions precisely by playfully violating them. But I think Faulkner has other aims. Perhaps he wants us or perhaps he wants to make the already active reader still more actively engaged by introducing this note of uncertainty, thereby forcing us to formulate our own ideas about the character's thoughts and motives, rather than merely relying on the narrator's own reportage. Again, Faulkner is, I think, at every point determined to make his reader a collaborator in the making of meaning, not a passive recipient. Now, the last stylistic feature I want to consider is Faulkner's deployment of symbols, something we've seen throughout, but which become, I think, more and more complex. Faulkner shares Yeats's conception of the poetic symbol as something that does not have a one-to-one correspondence with anything. It is not confined and monolithic in its meaning. Rather, for Faulkner, symbols operate as a manifold cluster of meanings that are compounded out of a single evolving image. Thus, a Faulknerian symbol can contain, and often does, even antithetical meanings within itself. Now, one of the richest in this respect, one of the richest symbols in Light in August is blood. Think about the diverse implications that Faulkner builds into blood in the novel as it develops, both as word and image, as it recurs. First of all, the word blood is used in reference to bloodlines, so that blood becomes, in this respect, a symbol of family inheritances that bind characters like Hightower and Joanna Burden. Family inheritance or family bloodlines that shape their attitudes and needs and beliefs. But blood is also clearly, throughout the novel, used in a racial sense. There is white blood and there is black blood flowing in Joe Christmas. When the brutal racist Max repeatedly smashes him in the face, he says, "We'll see if his blood is black, but we'll need a little more blood to tell for sure." The racial blood here is not just metaphoric, but it is also a very real blood that's trickling down Joe's face. And Joe Christmas licks his lip that has been battered, licks the blood like a child might lick a cooking spoon, tasting his own blood here as he did earlier when McGregor struck him and he tasted his own blood, licked it. Now, in this respect, blood becomes a symbol for Joe's moral masochism, the self-hating man's need to punish himself by provoking fights so as to be beaten, as we've seen repeatedly. His tasting of his blood then suggests that he needs and relishes this violence against himself as part of his ongoing self-crucifixion. But even as Joe seeks punishment, as we have seen, he also wants to shed the blood of others as an expression of his bitter hatred and desire for vengeance against both the black and white worlds. The culmination of this bloodletting, of course, comes when he slits Joanna Burden's throat with a razor. But note, if then in this respect, then blood becomes the symbol of Joe's murderous aggression against others, not simply against himself. Finally, there is blood symbolized in menstruation, which becomes for Joe Christmas the expression of female corruption and triggers other forms of bloodletting, as in particular when he kills the sheep and buries his hands in its blood after first hearing about menstrual blood, and then later strikes Bobby when she explains to him that she is having her period. Okay, now, with these elements of style and form behind us, let's return now to the novel as it unfolds. At the end of chapter 12, we saw Joe throwing away Joanna's Civil War-era family pistol, a symbol of that burden, that legacy to the past that she feels, throwing it away and fleeing into the darkness after the murder that night. Well, chapter 13 opens the following day, Saturday, as crowds gather at the murder scene, Joanna's house. After 8 retrospective chapters on Jo's history, we have now looped back to the Saturday when the novel opened, with Lena arriving around 1 p.m. in Jefferson as the smoke rises and Joanna Burden's house is on fire. Around that burned-out house, we now find, men and women have gathered. And here Faulkner reveals the dark side of Southern communities. Their urge is to irrational mob violence under the force of inherited racial hatred. The crowd would like to take the law into its own hands and lynch Joe Christmas, just as Hightower feared. They work themselves up to a rage by dwelling not just on Joe's alleged blackness, but on an entire race that he represents, that they now feel a profound, urgent need to vilify. Among them, the casual Yankees and the poor whites, and even the Southerners who had for a while lived in the North and who believed aloud that it was an anonymous Negro crime committed not by a Negro, but by a Negro with a capital N, and who knew, believed, and hoped that he had ravished her too, just so they could hate him more. So the hatless men who had deserted their counters and desks in town swung down, even including the one who ground the siren. They came up and were shown several different places where the sheet had lain, and some of them, with pistols ready in their pockets, began to canvass about for somebody to crucify. Well, ironically, what we find here, of course, is that the need to make Joe Christmas the scapegoat inadvertently casts him in the role of a Christ figure. Their desire to crucify him as a scapegoat establishes that fundamental connection that is already bound up in his name. Well, ironically as well, and hypocritically, the crowd's indignation over the murder of Joanna Burden is indignation over the death of a woman they never knew, who was an outcast because of her sympathy for blacks, and who lived, quote, lived and died a foreigner, a woman, in short, whom they hated as they hated her abolitionist grandfather, and whom we're told they could never forgive and let be dead in peace and quiet. They still hate the grandfather, and it is an extension, one might say, extended to a hatred of her. And yet, this is the woman who they now feel outraged because they believe that she has been violated and murdered by a black man. All of this, then, is forgotten simply because, for all of her contaminant elements in their eyes, she was, above all, for them at this moment, a white man and white woman, and that is all that matters. Even the women of Jefferson are irrationally titillated by the crime scene and the thought of a black man killing his white lover. They love to contemplate it in the same way that the men hope that she'd been ravished too, to titillate themselves and to work up their rage. And we're told that they think about this, these white women now of the town, with secret, passionate, glittering looks and secret, frustrated breasts, implying, of course, that at some level they fetishize black sexual masculinity and long for that forbidden thing themselves. Well, for these women, the murder and the murder scene are sources of entertainment, something that promises, quote, something beyond the sluttishness of their monotonous days. But the frenzy is more dangerous in the males, who are stirred up by two traits that Faulkner regards as the perverse and seemingly ineradicable legacy of white Southern men. First, racial hatred, ingrained over centuries, and second, a perverse preoccupation with white female sexuality. When the community of white men becomes a mob, individuality ceases to function and gives way to a primitive need, as I've suggested, for a black scapegoat. If Joe Christmas isn't apprehended, given this need, well, then any black man will do, because Joe represents a race that must be punished. Any black man will do, including the innocent one that the sheriff is questioning at this time, and whom the deputy later tortures to extract information about who was living in the cabin on Joanna Burden's property. We're told that it was as if all their individual five senses had become one organ now, one organ of looking. Like an apotheosis, the words that flew among them in the wind, air engendered. Is that him? Is that the one that did it? Sheriff's got him. Sheriff's already got him. By God, if that's him, what are we doing standing around here murdering a white woman, a black son of a... None of them had ever entered that house. While she was alive, they would not have allowed even their wives to call on her, but now they must avenge her, and they do so with one voice, with one irrational will to find and kill a black man to pay for the killing and for the sexual connection that led up to it. Well, it is only after describing this tumultuous gathering, both at Joanna's and then back in town, that Faulkner moves the narrative forward in time to a point where we haven't yet been. Now, the fictional present advances a few days to Tuesday night, 3 days after the fictional present at the start of the novel when we saw Lena Grove on the road. On this Tuesday night, Byron Bunch comes to Hightower's house once again. He had come on Sunday night, now he comes on Tuesday. The house itself evokes the alienated, reclusive clergyman in every possible sense. We're told that there was the stale, man-kept house, and when Hightower approaches, the smell of plump, unwashed flesh and unfresh clothing, that odor of unfastidious sedentation, of static overflesh, not often enough bathed. It is well nigh overpowering. Entering the house, Byron thinks, as he has thought before, that is his right. It may not be my way, but it is his way and his right. And he remembers how once he had seemed to find the answer, as though by inspiration, by divination. It's the odor of goodness. Of course it would smell bad to us that are bad and sinful. The stench of Hightower's house and of his unwashed body are the reek of a man who has cut himself off for 25 years, both from the world outside and from life in the present. As we've seen, Hightower has sequestered himself in a long act of atonement for his failures to his community and to his wife. And yet we've seen at the same time, paradoxically, he's embittered by his expulsion from his church and still preoccupied with the family history in the area that was the cause of his failure as a minister, but which still thrillingly binds him to that place. Faulkner speaks of, quote, that odor of overplump desiccation and stale linen as though a precursor of the tomb, because after all, Hightower's existence really is a kind of death in life. His house is a kind of airless tomb. And the deck chair that Hightower sits in fact, has molded itself to the shape of his sagging body over time, suggesting his lack of movement, certainly lack of movement outside the house. In short, the house is an extension of the isolated man himself, who clings there to his solitude and is terrified of re-entering a world that he associates with failure and bitterness. We're told that he watches, Byron watches the other's down-looking face, and Hightower thinks, I am not in life anymore. That's why there is no use in even trying to meddle, interfere. He could hear me no more than that man and that woman, aye, that child would hear or heed if I tried to come back into life. Yes. And yet, Byron says, brooding, out there where I thought the chance to harm a man or woman or child could have found me, no one could have found me, and she had hardly got there before I go out and blab the whole thing. I thought I was safe from doing harm, and yet I did harm anyway. Hightower, on the other hand, doesn't want to do harm or good because he is so terrified of engaging in life at all. But Byron believes in Hightower. Not just does he believe in Hightower's essential moral virtue that has endured, but he believes in Hightower's ability to come back to life in acting on that virtue. And each of Byron's visits pushes Hightower closer and closer to an agonizing reemergence in the outside world. When Byron then sniffs the fetid air of the house, given this faith in Hightower, he thinks it's the odor of goodness. Of course it would smell bad to us that are bad and sinful. This veneration of Hightower moves Byron to come to him for confession and advice. But it doesn't mean that Byron will always act on Hightower's ethical counsel, and this gradually becomes clear. This visit, Byron has come once again partly to confess his dishonesty to Lena, for which you'll recall Hightower had earlier absolved him. But Byron says he is still agonized by the fact that he inadvertently identified the dissolute bootlegger called Brown as the man she was seeking, Lucas Birch. Quote, I had to go and blab the whole thing, he says, with self-recrimination. But Byron is also distressed that in order to protect Lena, he has had to engage in a certain dishonesty. He has had to suppress information about Brown's association with Joe Christmas and the murder. So again, in this spirit of contrition, in this act of confession, he speaks to Hightower, and he says that it's like God sees that they found out what they need to know out of men's lying without needing to ask, and that they don't find out what they don't need to know without even knowing that they have not found it out. And so I don't know for sure what she, Lena, knows and what she don't know, except that I have kept it from her that it was the man she is hunting for that told on the murderer, and that he is in jail now, except when he is out running with the dogs, the man that took him up and befriended him. I have kept that from her. She does not know that the man she's looking for is in jail and that he has incriminated the murderer, Joe Christmas. How much more or less than that, he's not sure she knows, but he's tried to protect her by not telling her everything that he is aware of. In short, Byron tells Hightower that since Brown is in jail, he doesn't want her to know that, and that he is doing this protectively. But this protective dishonesty is not really what Byron has come to confess or to disclose. And Hightower knows this and sees through Byron as soon as he begins to claim, Byron does, that he is trying to do the right thing. If he was clearly so sure he was doing the right thing, there'd be no need to confess it. Men, after all, who do the right thing rarely have to justify or confess it, and Byron, in fact, does both. Because after confessing his feeling of guilt for his suppression of certain information for Lena Grove, he then goes on to say the following. I reckon I am trying to do the right thing by my lights, and that, Hightower thinks, is the first lie Byron ever told me, ever told anyone, man or woman, perhaps including himself. Or maybe it's not a lie yet because he does not know himself that it is a lie. Well, what exactly is Hightower referring to here? Well, Byron tells Hightower that since Brown is in jail, something he has not told Lena, that since Brown is in jail, he intends to take Lena to the now empty cabin on Joanna's property where Brown and Joe had lived, to take her there to have her baby, as if this dubious maneuver somehow was a way of keeping her safe, which is what he means when he says, I'm trying to do the right thing by my lights. Now, Hightower knows that Byron is in love with Lena, and that rather than sending her back to Alabama, he secretly hopes to win Lena's love and drive Brown away, hoping that when Brown comes back to the cabin and sees the baby, he will simply flee. Now, Byron's plan is to sleep in a tent nearby the cabin so as to keep guard and watch over Lena. Hightower sees that Byron is lying to himself then about his motives for this plan. It is not simply for Lena's protection, it is so that he can be near her and perhaps, he hopes, win her. And for this very reason, both because it is in some way dishonest and also because, after all, Lena is not Byron's woman, for these reasons, Hightower refuses to endorse the plan, okay? And there are other reasons as well. Staying out at that cabin, Lena would be far away from a doctor or a midwife. But more, he sees that Byron is seeking his own romantic aims under the guise of protection. And thus, he exposes Byron's lie, which he recognizes Byron may not even recognize as a lie himself, but makes it clear that he thinks it is a lie to himself, and denounces the plan because of it. You'll take her out there to his house, will you? And you'll see that she's comfortable, and you'll see that she's not disturbed until it's over. And then you'll tell that man Bunch or Brown, is she's there? Well, he'll run, Byron says. He does not look up. Yet through him there seems to go a wave, an exultation of triumph before he can curb and hide it. An exultation of triumph, the idea that Brown will go away and she'll be mine. Is that what you want him to do? Hightower says. Think what you are doing, Byron. You are attempting to come between man and wife. They ain't man and wife yet, he says. Does she think that? Do you believe, Byron, that she will say that? They look at one another. Ah, Byron, Byron, what are a few mumbled words before God, before the steadfastness of a woman's nature, before the child, Byron, Byron? Well, what do you think we ought to do then? What would you advise? Go away, Hightower says. Leave Jefferson. This is not what Byron Bunch, of course, wants to hear at all. Because when Hightower says it, they look at one another. No, Hightower says, you don't need my help. You are already being helped by someone stronger than I am. For a moment, Byron does not speak. They look at one another steadily. Helped by whom, he asked. By the devil, Hightower says. Well, that's harsh. Hightower's anger here, and it is excessive, derives from more than just his awareness of Byron's self-interest and self-deception. His anger is also due to his fear that Byron is making a terrible and possibly self-destructive mistake by committing his life to a woman who is not only another man's woman, but who has conceived a child out of wedlock. Thus, he says, go away, Byron, go away now, at once. Leave this place forever, this terrible place, this terrible, terrible place. I can read you. You will tell me that you have just learned love, and I will tell you that you have just learned hope. That's all, hope. The object does not matter, not to the hope, but even to you. There is but one end to this, to the road that you are taking, sin or marriage, and you refuse the sin. That's it. God forbid me. It will be marriage or nothing else for you. But then think about marrying this woman. What kind of a woman is it? Well, he suggests Lena is not as virtuous or as pure as you imagine. No woman who has a child, Byron, is ever betrayed. The husband of a mother, whether he be the father or not, is already a cuckold. Give yourself at least the 1 chance in 10, Byron. If you must marry, there are single women, girls, virgins. It's not fair that you should sacrifice yourself to a woman who was chosen once and now wishes to renege on that choice. It's not right. It's not just. God didn't intend it so when he made marriage. Well, Hightower's condemnation of Byron's plan, as he sees it, to acquire Lena is extreme because Hightower is bringing the grief and bitterness of his wife's infidelities to bear on his own judgment of Lena. Although Hightower knows that he failed his dead promiscuous wife emotionally and sexually, nonetheless, like Joe Christmas, he distrusts women, and he distrusts women's sexuality in particular. He also distrusts male romantic love, which he feels is all too easily deluded by desire. Later, he refers to Lena and Joanna as, quote, two lost women. He doesn't want his friend, Byron, to sacrifice himself for a woman who was capable of taking up with a man like Brown. She would be unworthy of Byron, Hightower suggests. And as for Lena Grove, he says, there are always going to be Lena Groves, there are always going to be Lucas Birches, and there are always going to be Byron Bunches. But, he suggests, no woman such as Lena deserves, quote, any more than one of them. She's already made her choice, and that choice was not you. Stay away from her. To put it another way, from Hightower's point of view, Lena has made her own mistake in choosing Byron, in choosing Lucas Birch, and become pregnant because of that mistake. She has in so doing shown her true colors and does not deserve a second chance. You should run, he tells Byron. Well, if Hightower resembles Joe Christmas in this misogynistic strain, he does so in other important ways within the oscillating structure of this novel. He, too, is an isolated man tortured by a combined self-hatred and resentment of the world. After 25 years of private penance, Hightower wants what Joe says he, too, longs for, and that is peace, to be out of the world, or at least in Hightower's case, out of the life of men. Well, re-entering that world of men, that world of the present, by contrast, for Hightower would be agonizing. And he feels that over 25 years of private penance, that he has already paid the price for the peace of this life-in-death state of hermetic isolation that he is seeking. He feels he has already paid the price and deserves now to be left alone in that state of what he calls peace. I won't have bought immunity. He says, I have bought immunity. I should not have to be drawn back. I've paid for it. I didn't quibble about the price. No man could say that, he says to himself. I just wanted peace. I paid them their price without quibbling. I wronged the world. I've been punished. I've punished myself. I've been shunned. Give me the peace of my solitude. And then sweat and heat and mirage all rushed and fused into a finality which abrogates all logic and justification and obliterates it like a firewood. I will not, he said. I will not be drawn back into life. Give me the peace of this death in life, which is his version of the peace that Joe Christmas seeks in death. But is Hightower's moribund existence really peace as he conceives of it? No. It's only when Byron tells Hightower, quote, I don't reckon for you to say that I'm wrong. And it's only when Byron, standing up to this condemnation, says he intends to follow through on his plan to take Lena out to the cabin anyway. Only then does Hightower surprisingly draw back from his condemnation and demonstrate something surprising. Instead of pushing the world away, he now moves to it almost involuntarily with a certain kind of spontaneous moral urgency. Because when Byron says, I'm going to go and take her out to the cabin anyway, suddenly Hightower says, is there anything I can do? Bedclothes and such. And will you let me know? Almost against his will. Well, as Byron leaves, Hightower thinks to himself, God bless him. God help me to be young. There is nothing else like it in the world. This private benediction reveals that while Byron's motives may be partly self-interested and dishonest, as Hightower realizes, nonetheless, Hightower recognizes also a certain vitality in that love that Byron feels for Lena Grove. But the thought of Hightower's own failed love in the past is so painful that in order to distract himself from thoughts of that past, he opens a book of Tennyson's poetry and tries to lose himself in the, quote, galloping language that recalls his own galloping ancestor in the Civil War. This kind of escapist reading is part of Hightower's life and death insulation from the present world and from other people. But it is a dead poetic world, quote, of sapless trees and dehydrated lusts. This, in short, is not peace. Now, Hightower is a man, then, trapped in a double time warp that he can't or won't get beyond, at least up until this point. He is paralyzed by his loss of his church and the death of his wife 2 decades earlier. Still paralyzed, as it were, at that time, 25 years earlier, but he is also immobilized or paralyzed by a more distant past, the past of his Civil War ancestors that he still imagines to be glorious, but which fatally infected his sermons and destroyed his married life. That double sense of the past that paralyzes him weighs Hightower down like the grotesque paunch that he carries around his midriff, that sagging flesh that burdens his every step. The question, then, is whether Hightower, unlike Joe Christmas and Joanna Burden, can cast off enough of the burden of his personal, familial, and cultural past in order to act with the moral independence that Byron sees in him, thinks he's capable of, and which Byron himself ultimately exemplifies. Meanwhile, Joe Christmas is both running away from capture and inevitably leaving clues that will ensure the capture and death that he desires as the only possible source of peace for him. While the sheriff and Brown and the bloodhounds exhibit an almost comical kind of Keystone Cops-esque ineptitude, Christmas is planting clues for his apprehension as he rages against the black and white worlds that he both hates outside himself and hates as strains within himself. Now, one trope that you might have noticed throughout Joe Christmas's days as a fugitive is how everyone he meets reacts to him with exaggerated terror, as if he were not a human being but some sort of monster or boogeyman or absolute other. This begins with the woman in the car that picks Joe up just after the murder. The woman sees Joe's gun, Joanna's gun, in his hand and begins to make, quote, choked wailing sounds in, quote, desperate terror. Well, these hysterical reactions or overreactions continue when Joe, in his flight, charges into a black church, knocks down an old man, beats the preacher, curses God, and crushes the skull of a man who is pursuing him. Terrifying as that is, consider Faulkner's description of the reaction. The congregation saw a man standing in the door. The door had not been locked or even shut yet. The man had apparently grasped it by the knob and hurled it back into the wall so that the sound crashed into the blended voices like a pistol shot. And then they saw that his face was not black, and a woman began to shriek, and people The rear began to spring up and began to run toward the door, and another woman on the mourner's bench, already in a semi-hysterical state, sprang up and whirled and glared at him for an instant with white rolling eyes and screamed, "It's the devil! It's Satan himself!" This before Joe has even actually attacked anyone. Well, note then that whites and blacks alike regard Joe Christmas as a source of menace, of exaggerated evil, of magnified terror. And Joe takes a certain vengeful gratification in this, in his capacity to frighten both races, this man of extreme alienation who hates both races. Faulkner's descriptions here, in the passage as I've cited, reflect another genre that he liked to draw upon, and that is Gothic fiction, with its emphasis on extreme states of fear and hysteria. In Absalom, and in stories like A Rose for Emily, which you may know, he transposes these Gothic conventions of the grotesque and the unspeakable to create what became known as Southern Gothic. But Faulkner infuses within the conventions of Gothic narrative extraordinary psychological complexity. When, for example, Joe enters the black church, he is, we realize, attacking not only the blackness that he hates in himself and the blackness of the community that he hates, he's also attacking God. This derives in part from Joe's contempt for the religious authority that has oppressed him, both from without and also from what he has internalized. He attacks the punishing God of McGurkin and Joanna, both of whom demand, you remember, that he kneel in atonement to a God who, in Joe's view, created a misbegotten world filled with injustice and suffering. How grotesque to make one bow to such a God. Beyond God, however, Joe despises all authority, from his adoptive father to the military, which he deserts. Yet paradoxically, Joe also needs and wants to be apprehended and punished to death by authority, because, of course, he hates his very being and cannot endure any longer the fact of his own existence. Thus, as noted, he leaves clues, like the penciled note to the sheriff with, quote, the unprintable phrase, almost certainly fuck you, and the heavy shoe tracks that he makes no effort to conceal during his week as a fugitive. Of these, we are told, the trail was good and easily followed because of the dew. The fugitive had apparently made no effort whatever to hide it. They could even see the prints of his knees and hands where he had knelt to drink at a spring. I never yet knew a murderer who had more sense than that about the folks that would chase him, the deputy said. And then they would look down. Yep, he sat down here and rested here. Here's his footmarks, these same rubber heels of these shoes. Heel marks that Joe intentionally leaves. Well, he wears these particular, rather cumbersome shoes deliberately, having traded a black woman for them. It's not that Joe is embracing his blackness here as an affirmation of his racial identity by wearing these shoes. No. Rather, he wears them because Joe associates his blackness with the end of his life that he craves. Soon, Faulkner writes, Joe looks at, quote, the black shoes smelling of Negro as the gauge of the black tide creeping up his legs, moving his feet upward as death moves. It is a coming death. It is a crucifixion that Joe desires, and yet, despite that deep desire to die, largely unconscious but overpowering, despite that, he continues to run for 7 days. He does so, we're told, without consciously asking himself why he is running, because more deeply, of course, he wants to be captured. Faulkner tells us that, quote, Christmas's mind did not need to bother to remember why he was running. What we find then in this conflicted behavior, in which he is running away from the apprehension and death that he desires, and what we find throughout Light in August is what in psychology is called cognitive dissonance. The term refers to the discomfort or stress an individual experiences in holding two contradictory beliefs or attitudes or desires at once, and especially when the individual behaves in a way that contradicts the more deeply held belief or conviction or desire. Thus, Joe Christmas runs from the law even as he leaves traces and tracks to guide the law. Now, this is not the first time or the first instant of Joe's contradictory behavior. Earlier, you recall, as an adolescent, he acknowledged that all women menstruate. Painfully acknowledged it, but was able to say to himself after slaughtering the sheep, "All right, but not in my life and my love." This is true, but this is also true, contradictory though they may be. We saw another form of cognitive dissonance in Joanna Burden, who, we're told, took sexual pleasure in reenacting the loss of her virginity, but also regarded her nightly struggle against Joe as would-be rapist as a confirmation of her continuing moral virtue and resistance to sexual sin. Well, eventually, Joe recognizes consciously that he doesn't want to run. But for a time, the instinct to flight and survival operate within him as habits that are well ingrained because, remember, he had been on the run for 15 years, not long before this, during his life. For a while, and thus he eats. For a while, he had been hungry all the time. He gathered and ate rotting and worm-riddled fruit. Now and then he crept into fields and dragged down and gnawed ripened ears of corn as hard as potato graters. He thought of eating all the time, imagining dishes and food. He would think of that meal set for him on the kitchen table 3 years ago, and he would live again through the steady and deliberate backswinging of his arm as he hurled the dishes into the wall with a kind of writhing and excruciating agony of regret and remorse and rage. Then one day he was no longer hungry. The absence of hunger suggests, of course, a movement more and more toward the embrace of death itself. But you'll note that in this description, Joe lives for a time on rotting, worm-eaten fruit. And in doing so, he recalls the meals that he threw away, now with a certain kind of regret, but with the same kind of rage that he had also felt earlier in rejecting them. It was bound up with his rage at women for their deceit and manipulation that had caused him, as he recalls these meals, to overturn Mrs. McGurkin's tray of food and to hurl Joanna Burden's dishes against the wall as, quote, women's muck, thinking back then at the time, this is fun. Well, since his days in the orphanage, remember, Joe has always associated food with female deception, temptation, corruption, and ultimately unpleasure. Thus, as we've seen, he not only hurls food, but regurgitates food. First, the forbidden toothpaste, then vomiting after Bobby's description of menstruation. Bobby linked with food insofar as, remember, she first met him as a waitress, serving him food. Well, now the worm-ridden food that he eats makes him sick again, as he had been vomiting twice before, and he expels it as he had expelled the toothpaste. It is only when we're told he was now no longer hungry that Joe begins consciously to recognize that he is no longer hungry because he does not wish to live. Thus, we are told, they all want me to be captured, he thought, and then when I come up ready and to say, here I am, yes, I would say, here I am tired. I am tired of running, of having to carry my life like it was a basket of eggs. I am tired. All he wants in death is peace. Well, in order to conceive of an ending to his life, which Joe now understands that he is seeking, but in order to conceive of that ending, Joe needs to know what day of the week it is so that he can make a decisive change. That decisive change being to stop running and deliberately embrace death, as if somehow that decisive change could gain a kind of clarity and cohesion and meaning for him if, not unlike Zeno, he attaches it to a particular calendar date. Well, this is important because in his conflicted running, even as he wishes to be caught unconsciously, Joe has lost all sense of chronicity. He has been acting all the time as if he simultaneously wanted to die and wanted to live, and in this respect he seems to be outside time altogether for much of this week. We're told that one day he was walking along and he tripped. He just fell at full length, believing for a while that he was still on his feet but still running. And he was lying down on his face in a shallow ditch at the edge of a plowed field. And he falls asleep and then wakes, and I must have been asleep, he thought. I've slept more than 6 hours. I must have gone to sleep running without knowing it. That is what I did. He felt no surprise. Time and spaces of light and dark had long since lost orderliness for him. He could never know when he would pass from one to the other, from light to darkness, when he would find that he had been asleep without remembering ever having lain down, or find himself walking without remembering having waked. Sometimes it would seem to him that a night of sleep in hay or in a ditch beneath an abandoned roof would be followed immediately by another night without interval of the day. Day and night, light and dark, the concept of hours that we measure in relation to day and night, all of these things seem completely lost to him as he's engaged over the course of a week in this peculiar cognitive dissonance of running away from the thing that he desires, capture. Well, when Joe asks a black man what day it is, and he learns that it is Friday, this return to calendar time allows him then to think consciously that a change will come and to plan it as a function of time. He has been running exactly a week, he now knows, and he can now thus allow himself to be captured. He found that he was trying to calculate the day of the week. It was as though now, and at last, he had an actual and urgent need to strike off the accomplished days toward some purpose, some definite day to act without either falling short or overshooting it. He wants to plan his death. Well, remember that Joe Christmas had intended to reveal himself, plans to reveal himself in Jefferson, where he had fled from the killing. But having made that plan, he makes it only as far as the town of Mottstown, 20 miles to the north. As he rides into town in a wagon that ironically recalls Lena Grove at the beginning of the novel, as he rides into town, Joe understands that he is now deliberately consigning himself to death, the only place where peace may be possible. But Joe also realizes that he is in his running, he has been trying and failing to escape from his ineluctable past, and realizes that that has never, ever been possible in any of the running he's been engaged in. Now, as he enters the street, he thinks of that street that has run for 30 years, that street which, from the time he was 3 years old, seems to be one of perpetual running and running and running to try to escape something which he's never escaped. It's been a paved street where going should be fast, but it had made a circle, and he was inside that circle. Thus he thinks, I have never got outside that circle. I have never broken out of the ring of what I have already done and can never, ever undo. He thinks quietly, sitting on the seat, with planted on the dashboard before him his shoes, the black shoes smelling of Negro, that mark on his ankles, the gauge definite and ineradicable of the black tide creeping up his legs, moving from his feet upward as death moves. Joe thinks specifically of the recent past, the murder, as that constricting circle that he cannot get out of. But Faulkner suggests, and Joe seems to understand, that it's not just that he can't get beyond the consequences of that act. His entire life has been a futile orbit that he can't break out of no matter how or where he runs, because his life is circumscribed not just by his immediate past, but by other pasts, by his mixed racial ancestry, by the conditions of his birth and the death of his mother, by his early abusive upbringing. Well, part of this inescapable inheritance of the past is what is passed down to Joe from his grandfather, Doc Hines. When the old man rails against the menstruation of his daughter, Joe's mother, he says that menstruation is the woman's sign of God's damnation already on her. And we recall there Joe's own misogynistic disgust with women's periodic bleeding. He and this Doc Hines, who regards him as a living abomination, share that. He's inherited that somehow as part of this constricting circle of his life from his grandfather. And when Hines bursts into the black church to declaim hatefully from the pulpit that the white man was meant to rule over the black, Doc Hines unknowingly anticipates exactly what Joe does, in a sense, while he's a fugitive, breaking in to a black church to denounce them. Now, I noted that Mottstown was not Joe's intended destination for capture when he became fully conscious of his desire to surrender to death. But it is, after all, appropriate that he present himself there, particularly in the context of the circle of his life, because Hines, the grandfather who abducted him and took him to the orphanage, Hines is residing in Mottstown. This man from whom Joe has inherited his angry belligerence and his misogyny. This individual who was so intimately connected with Joe's earliest days of life. Now, unknowingly, then, in coming to the place where the man who first took him away as an infant is living, unknowingly, Joe has made a full circle back in his life, back to this man, to this originary source, the man who let Joe's mother die, bleeding to death after bearing him, and the man who shot Joe's black father to death, and the man who left Joe as an infant on the orphanage steps on Christmas Eve. The history of Joe's infancy comes to us in delayed fashion in chapter 15, after Doc Hines hears that a man named Christmas has been captured for the killing of a white woman. Suddenly, the old man erupts in fury, forces his way through the crowd in the center of town, and attacks Joe. Thus, we're given this description. Of the entire group, the captive was the only calm one. They held Hines, cursing his old frail bones and his string-like muscles for the time inherent with the fluid and supple fury of a weasel. It was a full pause, but before they could grasp Hines again, after he writhed free, he had raised the stick and struck the captive once, and he was trying to strike again when they caught him at last and held him, impotent and raging, with that light, thin foam about his lips. They had not stopped his mouth. "Kill the bastard," he cried. "Kill him! Kill him!" Hines' deranged aggression is rooted in two of his beliefs. First, the news that a black man, any black man, has killed a white woman is for Hines an inversion of God's decree that the white race was created to rule over the black. It is, of course, a perverted creed rooted in hatred that this crazy old man nonetheless promulgates so vociferously that he breaks into African American churches to proclaim from their pulpits their inferiority. Second, and more important, he is, of course, moved here to violent action because Joe is the source of Hines's uncontrollable wrath against mixed race. He now believes, Hines does, that God has brought the captive, Joe Christmas, back to him, to the place where he lives, specifically so that he, Hines, can personally execute divine justice by killing Christmas. That is, executing Joe Christmas not for the crime of murder, but rather for the previous crime of existing at all as a mixed-race human being. This is what Hines regards as a fundamental ontological evil and has been waiting to see how God will punish it. Now, as Hines had told the dietitian nearly 30 years earlier, Joe's very being is an abomination because it's a mixing of black and white blood. Thus, he now tells the sheriff that he has, quote, a right to kill the captive Joe because God has chosen him to do so. He is God's executioner. God had told him to wait until he showed him a sign and revealed to him the time that would be right for God to strike down Joe Christmas through the agency of Doc Hines, and now he believes that moment has come. Seeing Joe in custody in Mottstown is that sign. Well, Hines speaks of himself in the third person here as he talks to Byron and Hightower, a peculiar dissociation that suggests that, again, he sees himself acting not just on his own, but somehow as a vehicle of some divine plan. He says, "And then the Lord said to old Doc Hines, 'You watch now, watch my will a-working.'" Paradoxically, Hines had earlier, you recall, to protect Joe from the dietitian's wrath as a child, and he did so in order for God to use him, Doc Hines, to work his will to punish Joe Christmas in the future. This is a God who will not be satisfied, apparently, until Hines has killed his own grandson. Thus, we're told, Hines says, "Oh, yes, he's still a work in my earth." And old Doc Hines kept in touch with God, and at night he said, "That bastard, Lord." And God said, "He is still walking my earth." And old Doc Hines kept in touch with God, and one night he wrestled, and he strove, and he cried aloud, "That bastard, Lord, I feel the teeth of the fangs of evil." And God said, "It's that bastard. Your work is not yet done. He's a pollution. He's an abomination on my earth. But wait, now the time has come." Now, Hines's creed is the most horrific version in the novel of several forms of Protestantism that Faulkner critiques, and that Gale Hightower, who was once himself a Presbyterian minister, reflects upon as a poison inheritance in the South that ultimately promotes hatred, aggression, a denial of life. In short, a creed that ultimately promotes only death. These thoughts come to the defrocked Hightower as he's listening to the sounds coming from the church where he himself once preached. And now, listening to these sounds, this is what they mean to him. The music has still a quality stern, implacable, deliberate, and without passion, demanding in sonorous tones death, as though death were the boon, like all Protestant music. It was as though they who accepted it and raised their voices to praise it were praising death. Listening, he seems to hear within the music the apotheosis of his own history, his own land, his own environed blood. Pleasure and ecstasy, they seem, these people, unable to bear, Hightower thought. Their escape from it, from pleasure and ecstasy, is in violence, in drinking, in fighting, in praying. Catastrophe, too, a violence identical and apparently inescapable. And so why should not their religion drive them to crucifixion of themselves and to one another? If you hate life that much, all you can do is wish to inflict pain. Now, the question that emerges here about the nature of Christian faith is one that we see not just in Hightower's thoughts about the religion that he used to practice himself, but more broadly, representations of fundamentalist Protestantism throughout the course of this novel. There are really 4 variations on it. First, there is the fire and brimstone Presbyterianism that Hightower's congregation had wanted him to preach, but he had failed to provide. Second, there is McGurkin's rigid evangelicism with its emphasis on man's unworthiness and sensual depravity. Then there is Hines' deranged religion of white supremacy that I've just described. And finally, there is the Burden family view that both white and black races are cursed by God. Now, all of these are variations on Calvinism. And despite their differences in emphasis, these 4 fundamentalist Protestant views share 2 basic features. First, a sense that man is intrinsically sinful and that God hates and will punish the majority of mankind because of their sinfulness, and especially for their carnal sins. Pleasure and ecstasy, as Hightower calls them, these are the things that this particular kind of Calvinist Protestantism cannot bear. To be in a state of pleasure, let alone ecstatic pleasure, is to be ensnared by Satan. Sensual pleasure is evil in all 4 of these variations. And the second thing that all 4 share is the view that life is essentially predestined by God, a core Calvinist belief. The grim fatalism we find, and the fear that most of mankind is hopelessly damned from the start, is crucial precisely because the people who view life that way necessarily have to hate the world, hate others, and unless they are absolutely convinced they are one of the few elect, they must necessarily also hate themselves as being irrevocably damned. Now, this fatalist ideology, internalized over generations, becomes part of the historical and cultural determinism that shapes the destiny of Faulkner's characters, the destiny of these guilt-ridden, self-hating characters who, even when they rebel against this poisonous fundamentalism and its tenets, like Joe Christmas and Joanna Burden, in rebellion against it, nonetheless are victimized by it because they have inherited it, assimilated it, and turned it against themselves in self-punishing ways. Now, Hightower knows that this kind of Christianity is a religion without love or compassion. And he thinks then, as he listens to the church music, of Joe Christmas as he imagines him behind bars, hearing the sounds of that worship from his jail cell. He thinks of the doomed man in the barred cell within hearing of that music, and of the 2 other churches on that Sunday night, and in whose crucifixion they too will raise a cross, and they will do it gladly. These churches will be glad to crucify this man. Thus he thinks, since to pity him would be to admit self-doubt, and to hope for and need pity themselves, they will do it. They will kill him gladly, gladly. That's why it is so terrible, terrible, terrible. A religion founded by Christ ostensibly, but a religion without love, pity, or forgiveness. A religion which can only reflect their assumption that the God who creates man doesn't love him, but rather seems to hate him. Now, the question posed by Hightower's moral intelligence, an intelligence that can look at the religion he once was a part of and see it for the monstrous inversion of love that it is. The questions that it poses are these. Can Hightower, who has inherited this loveless, life-denying religious tradition, break free of his own past and with an act of compassion that is missing in his community, respond to this man who he's never met before, but he imagines suffering in jail? Can he break free from his own religious past, in short, in order to act? Second, can a man who was so wounded by a woman, even though he had failed his wife, a man who was so overcome by a certain misogynistic vein, can he overcome that prejudice and fear of women sufficiently to help Lena Grove in her hour of need? And finally, can a man, Hightower, who, quote, lives dissociated from mechanical time, again an echo of Joe during that week when he's outside time completely, Hightower's been outside it for 25 years, can a man who lives dissociated from mechanical time in his paralysis in the past re-enter life again in the present? That's the largest question of all, because he cannot help either Lena or Joe if he doesn't. Well, Byron Bunch, again, puts Hightower to the test in this respect. And it is an extraordinary moment, because in trying to protect Joe Christmas and in gaining Hightower's support for trying to save Joe Christmas, Byron, this uneducated white man, is himself rising above his Southern heritage of assimilated racism. It is one of the rarest and most remarkable, and there are only a couple of these, the rarest and most remarkable manifestation of free will in a novel in which there seems to be such determinism. When Byron describes Joe Christmas's arrest and his incarceration, Hightower first insults Byron for coming to him with this news, quote, as the guardian and public weal of morality. Yes. But then Hightower begins to cry because he knows that Byron is asking him to summon the moral courage to become involved, though the specific form of that involvement, as he weeps, has not even yet been articulated. Rather, we're told, and then Hightower begins to cry, sitting huge and slack and lax in the sagging chair. I don't mean that. You know I don't. But it's not right to bother me, to worry me. Then I have, when I've taught myself to stay, this should come to me, taking me after I am old and reconciled to what they deemed. Then Byron asked, but you're a man of God. You can't dodge that. I'm not a man of God, and not through my own desire. Remember that. Not of my own choice. I am no longer a man of God. Must my life after 50 years be violated and my peace destroyed by two lost women, Byron? Joanna Burden and specifically Lena. It was not my choice that I'm not a man of God. Remember that. Okay, let us consider this for a moment. Now, for the first time, implicitly, Hightower acknowledges, even as he says that he's not a man of God, that he is a man of God because he insists that it was not my choice, which he repeats twice. He is a man of God who is failed, who is repentant, who is embittered, but whom he makes it clear now, for all of his sins, was driven out, not by his own choice. Thus, in his own eyes, the implication is, I am a man of God. Remember that, even though I'm not. It wasn't my choice, so thus I am. Certainly, however, if Hightower is in his own mind still a man of God, he's not a man of God any longer, or not one who serves the God of McGurkin or Joe Hines or Joanna Burden. Now, before we consider Hightower's response to Byron's appeal, specific appeal to help Joe Christmas, consider how Faulkner presents Joe Christmas's capture and arrest in Mottstown. Faulkner gives the community that we have seen gathering around the jail and worshiping in church now a collective voice as he describes Joe's arrival in Mottstown. Okay, this is not the same community as in Jefferson, who gathered around the sheriff's office and who gathered in the square and who gathered at Joanna's. It's another group, but it's a group, again, of Southern whites, and they are monovocal. They are reduced to one thing. It is now, quote, they who are described, and they in this single voice of narrative, describe how Joe entered town and almost ritualistically went to the barber and got a shave and a haircut shortly after entering, and how he was recognized and apprehended by Halliday, who collects the $1,000 reward that Brown was seeking. And they describe again, as a single voice, undifferentiated, unindividualized, the strange behavior of the little round woman, Mrs. Hines, who would not be satisfied until she had looked into Joe Christmas's face. Now, although the communal voice here is more amazed than it is hostile, the very fact that Faulkner can reduce a community's response to a single they spoke, in this case Mottstown, not Jefferson's, nonetheless reduce it to a single perspective, once again suggests the danger of a collective mentality in which attitudes have been shaped by past generations and in which individual moral dissent, like Byron's or like Hightower's, is therefore so profoundly difficult and so dangerous. Here's how they describe Joe's appearance when he first turns up in Mottstown. We're told, and then he walked the streets in broad daylight like he owned the town. And when they said, "Ain't you named Christmas?" he never denied it. And that's what made folks so mad. For him to be a murderer and all dressed up and walk in the town like he dared them to touch him when he ought to have been skulking and hiding in the woods, muddy and dirty and running. But no. Rather, taking it all in, even after they beat him up. Taking it in, not saying anything, just bleeding, sullen, and quiet. Well, the community is almost as outraged that Joe presents himself with a kind of cool, unrepentant swagger as they are at the crime that he's accused of. But as ever, we see that through this behavior, Joe is deliberately provoking the white community, both because he hates it and because he wants and needs for it to beat him. They do. And he takes the punches, quote, not saying anything, bleeding, sullen, and quiet, as he has throughout the novel, after being beaten almost with a kind of gratitude. Now, remember that this is the same type of Southern community that years earlier acquitted Doc Hines, decades earlier, of killing Joe Christmas's father, because although he shot him in cold blood, the father, Joe's father, was a black circus worker who was consorting with a white man's daughter. And that was enough to exonerate Hines of the crime. Well, when Byron brings the deranged old Hines and his wife to talk to Hightower, the agonized ex-minister repeatedly asks, "What do you want from me? What do you want me to do?" Well, it's directed not just at the Hineses, but also, of course, at Byron. Hines's long-suffering and aggrieved wife asks Hightower for the impossible. If Hightower could arrange for Joe Christmas to be released for a day so that she could then be with the child that had been taken from her after her daughter's death in infancy, so that she could, quote, pretend like it hadn't happened, like folks never knew him as a man that had been killed. She wants this impossible act of temporary liberation of Joe just to serve a kind of compensatory fantasy, this woman who has suffered over his absence for over 30 years. Well, Hightower knows that that simply cannot be. But he also realizes that the real request, and the much more difficult request, because it in fact is one that is not without plausibility, is the one that Byron has come to ask him to perform. And that drives him to tears of agony even before he finds out exactly what it is, perhaps because he anticipates it. Thus, he asks Byron, "What is it that you want me to do? Shall I go plead guilty to the murder for him? Is that it?" Byron's face cracks with that grimace, faint, fleeting, sardonic, weary, without mirth. "It's next to that, I reckon." Then his face sobers. It is quite grave. It's a poor thing to ask. God knows, I know that. There is a price for being good, the same as for being bad, a cost to pay, and it's the good men that can't deny the bill when it comes around. Remarkable bit of ethical wisdom from Byron. And it won't be like you haven't done it before, haven't already paid a bill like it once before. He's going to ask Hightower to lie, knowing that Hightower has lied at times in the past, but to lie to save Joe Christmas. What is it, he asks again, I am to do, Byron? Byron watches his slow and ceaseless hand, musing. He ain't never admitted that he done killed her, and all the evidence they got against him is Brown's word, which is next to none. You could say he was there with you that night. Every night when Brown said he watched him go up to the big house and go to it, folks would believe you. They would believe that anyway. And now you are old. They wouldn't do anything to you about it. That would hurt you now. Basically, you have so little to lose in that respect. Byron knows that in asking Hightower to lie to save Joe Christmas, to claim that Joe Christmas has been coming to see him when Brown claimed he was going to see Joanna Burden, that in asking him for this lie, which would essentially exonerate Joe of the charge of miscegenation and murder, that he is asking his friend to re-enter the world, forcing him, tempting him to re-embrace the present, to enter the world on behalf of another human being for whom he feels pity. And he forces Hightower at this moment to wrestle with this moral dilemma of saving a man's life who he feels will be lynched at the cost of his own excruciating discomfort. Well, it's one thing to dismiss Byron's passive, protective lies to Lena, okay? But it is another thing to lie himself actively on behalf of a man that they both know will never receive a fair trial, be he guilty or innocent, and to lie on behalf of a man he has never met or seen and until quite recently had never even heard of. Now, in this making this request, Byron reminds Hightower of two things that Hightower already knows. First, as he said, that good, moral men like Hightower have an obligation to act on that goodness, a cost to pay. Good men can't deny it when the bill comes round because they are good men like you. They have an obligation to act on their goodness when confronted with hatred and injustice. And the second thing he reminds Hightower of is that Hightower has lied before in his life, inventing fictions, for example, about what his wife was doing when he knew very well that she was in Memphis consorting with other men. Now, as we'll see next time, Hightower does act, but only after responding to Byron's proposal with anguish and rage. He tries first to suggest that Byron is presenting him with this temptation, this ethical challenge, because freeing Joe Christmas with a false alibi would make it easier to remove Brown and therefore allow Byron to claim Lena. This is his way, Hightower's way, of trying to get out of it by casting aspersions on Byron's intention. Brown, then, without the reward, could be scared into making her child legitimate, and then into fleeing again, and forever this time. And then it would be just her and Byron, he thought, since I am just an old man who has been fortunate enough to grow old without having to learn the despair of love. He's shaking when he looks up now. Now, he doesn't actually accuse Byron of this, but he's certainly considering it because he's wondering, in fact, if he can justify inaction to himself by suggesting that it is all part of Byron's desire to get rid of Brown indirectly in order to claim Lena. But in his heart, Hightower knows that Byron's love for Lena isn't what is motivating him to urge this intervention to save Joe's life. Byron is thinking partly of the feelings of Mrs. Hines, the woman, that little tormented woman whose husband stood outside years before, refusing to call a doctor as their daughter Millie bled to death in childbirth, who later had to deal with the knowledge that her husband was taking the infant Joe, a woman who suffered when Hines told her, "He's dead to you and to me and to all God's world." Byron is moved in part to try to want to save Christmas on behalf of this aggrieved old woman. To find the lost child still alive, on the other hand, as she has now, and then to face the prospect of seeing him hanged is simply too cruel. Byron surely feels and knows that this is the case, and Hightower understands that too. But Byron's request for Hightower's intervention, for this protective, saving lie, is also very likely motivated by the story that Hines has told him, and that he then makes Hines repeat to Hightower. It is a tale that suggests that the terrible traumas and abuses of Joe Christmas' infancies had contributed to his doomed life and to whatever he may or may not have done. Well, Hightower rages at his friend Byron because the request has induced the agony of ethical involvement that he's tried so long to avoid. Byron realizes that Hightower is really struggling then in this private Gethsemane, not against him so much, but against himself, struggling to overcome the inertia and the fear. Thus, he knows it when Hightower rages at him. "It's not because I can't. Don't dare to," Hightower says. "It's because I won't. I won't. Do you hear that?" He raises his hands as from the chair arms. "It's because I won't do it." Byron does not move. His hand on the desktop has ceased. He watches the other, thinking, "It ain't me he's shouting at. It's like he knows there is something nearer him than me to convince of that." Suddenly, Hightower's voice rises higher yet. "Get out," he screams. "Get out of my house. Get out of my house." And then he falls forward onto the desk, his face between his extended arms and his clenched fists. Hightower casts Byron and the Hineses out of his house, and he appears paralyzed in a paroxysm of anguish and fear. And yet, as we'll see in our final exploration of Light in August next time, Hightower does in fact act, and act in the most productive way possible within the limits of what is humanly possible in terms of moral action within Faulkner's universe. Okay, have a nice weekend.